Food chains and food webs. So we're talking about that today as well. Why are those important? Well, we just talked about in when we went over definitions of ecosystems how energy and biochemical matter is recycled and moved around through an ecosystem. So we're going to talk today about how that moves and why food chains and food webs are such an integral part of each ecosystem. Organisms of different species can interact in many ways. They can compete or they can be symbionts, long-term partners with a close association. Or of course, they can do what we often see in nature programs. One of them can eat the other. Chomp. That is, they can form one of the links in a food chain. In ecology, a food chain is a series of organisms that eat one another so that energy and nutrients flows from one to the next. For example, if you had a hamburger for lunch, you might be part of a food chain that looks like this. The cow eats the grass, or the grass goes to the cow goes to the human. But what if you had lettuce on your hamburger? In that case, you're also part of a food chain that looks like this. Lettuce to human. As this example illustrates, we can't always fully describe what an organism such as a human eats with one linear pathway. For situations like the one above, we may want to use a food web that consists of many intersecting food chains and represents the different things an organism can eat and be eaten by. So we're going to talk about autotrophs versus heterotrophs. So what are autotrophs? What are heterotrophs? Autotrophs are known as self-feeders. They can make their own food. Auto means automatic. Their own organic compounds out of simple molecules like carbon dioxide. So think about any of those autotrophs that you know that make their own food. Photoautotrophs, such as plants, use energy from sunlight to make other organic compounds, sugars, out of carbon dioxide, and they use photosynthesis for that. Chemoautotrophs use energy from chemicals to build organic compounds out of carbon dioxide or similar molecules. These are called chemosynthesis. For example, there are hydrogen sulfide oxidizing chemoautotrophic bacteria found in undersea vent communities where no light can reach. So autotrophs, keep that in mind, they make their own food. They are using energy or biochemicals components to create their own food. They don't need to ingest or eat another animal or plant. Heterotrophs. Heterotrophs, also known as other feeders, can't capture light or chemical energy to make their own food. Humans are heterotrophs, so we actually need to physically eat something and ingest things to get that energy. Animals, fungi, and many bacteria are heterotrophs. When we talk about heterotrophs' role in food chains, we can then call them consumers. Okay, so we're consuming things, we're eating them. Food chain. A food chain is a linear sequence of organisms through which nutrients and energy pass as one organism eats the other. Let's take a look at the typical food chain, starting at the bottom, the producers, and moving upward. So you have the primary producers, which are first at the bottom. The primary producers are autotrophs, okay? So those are organisms or living things that are really just making their own food. Those are the primary producers. Organisms that eat these things, the primary producers or the plants, are called primary consumers, okay? Their primary consumers are made up of herbivores, plant eaters. The organisms that eat the primary consumers, so who eats the primary consumers? The secondary consumers. Secondary consumers are generally meat eaters. So at the bottom, you have just the plants. The next step up, you have the animals that just strictly eat the plants, herbivores. After that, on the second or the third step, you have the secondary consumers. Those would be animals that eat meat, the carnivores. The organisms that eat the secondary consumers are called tertiary consumers. These are carnivore eating carnivores like eels or big fish. Some food chains have additional levels, such as quaternary consumers that eat tertiary consumers. Organisms at the very top of the food chain are called apex consumers. We can see examples of these levels in the diagram below. The green algae are primary producers, eaten by mollusks. The primary consumers, the mollusks, and be lunch for the slimy sculpin fish. The secondary consumer, which itself is eaten by the larger fish, the Chinook salmon, a tertiary consumer. So the food chain is always starting, as you guys can see this visual, it is always starting with a autotroph. It is starting at the bottom. It is starting with things that make their own food, okay? Plants, algae. So who's going to eat those plants and algae? Just animals that eat plants and algae. And then you're going to have what's going to eat those, the primary consumers. You're going to have the secondary consumers. And then lastly, what's going to eat the secondary consumers? Well, the tertiary consumers. So primary means first, secondary means second, tertiary means third. All in order. Okay, so let's scroll down past that. Let's talk about decomposers. So decomposers are organisms that break down dead organic material and waste. They're sometimes considered at their own trophic level. As a group, they eat dead matter and waste products that come from organisms at various other trophic levels. So they would happily consume a decaying plant, the body of a half-eaten squirrel, the remnants of a deceased eagle. So decomposers will really eat anything, and they're really an integral part of breaking stuff down and releasing that matter that we talked about back into the ecosystem or in the environment. The decomposers will return that matter, that energy into the soil, in which it will get recycled again by the plants and then animals that eat the plants. Food webs. Food chains give us a clear-cut picture of who eats whom. However, some problems come up when we try to describe whole ecological communities. For instance, an organism can sometimes eat multiple types of prey or be eaten by multiple predators. This is what happens when you eat a hamburger patty. The cow is the primary consumer, and the lettuce leaf on the patty is the primary producer. To represent how these relationships more accurately, we can use a food web, a graph that shows all the trophic eating-related interactions between various species in an ecosystem. So you could see on the visual that is provided to you, don't start at the top, always start at the bottom. The bottom of this is the first of the food chain. See at the bottom, those are lined with plants, autotrophs. They make their own food. Well, who's eating those autotrophs? So there's a huge list of primary consumers that will be feeding on those plants, such as mollusks, amphipods, invasive water fleas. And then who are eating those primary consumers? Well, you have the secondary consumers eating those, okay? And there's a huge list of them: the lake whitefish, slimy sculpin, yellow perch. And then who's eating those secondary consumers? Well, the tertiary consumers, which are lake trout, Chinook salmon, brown trout, rainbow trout. Okay, so you can just see that visual of all the different types of consumers in your chart, and how that it's not just one specific type of organism feeding on one specific type of consumer. Okay, there's a whole list of it. There's a whole list of how these things can interact. Grazing versus detrital food webs. Food webs usually don't show decomposers. You might have noticed that the Lake Ontario food web does not. Yet all ecosystems need ways to recycle dead materials and waste. For example, in a meadow ecosystem shown below, there is a grazing food web of plants and animals that provides inputs For detrital food web, a bacterial fungi. The detrital web is shown in simplified form in brown band across the bottom of the diagram. In reality, it would consist of various species linked by specific feeding interactions, that is, connected by arrows, as in the grazing food web above ground. Detrital food webs can contribute energy to grazing food webs, as when a robin eats an earthworm. So you can see how all that, once again in that visual, you can see how all those things can interact with one another. And lastly, let's talk about the energy transfer efficiency limits food chain lengths. When energy enters at the trophic level, some of it is stored as biomass as part of an organism's body. This is the energy that's available to the next trophic level, since only energy stored as biomass can get eaten. As a rule of thumb, only about 10% of the energy that's stored as biomass in one trophic level per unit time ends up being stored in biomasses in the next trophic level. This is the 10% rule of energy transfer. So scroll down to the visual, your last visual, and they have a pyramid there, and that is showing you, starting with the bottom, the primary producers or the light energy. Over on the right hand side, it says 20,000 kcals. So that's how that is representative of energy. And then when you go up to the primary consumers, you can see that's only 10% of that, and the secondary consumers are only getting 10% of that, so 200. The tertiary consumers are only getting 10% of that 200, so they're getting 20 calories. And then up at the top, the quaternary consumers only get 10% of that, which is 2 calories, okay? But all at the same time, they're all excreting heat and waste and dead matter, which goes to the decomposers, which then gets recycled back. So if you are grass, if you are an autotroph, if you are making your own food, you are getting the most energy. And the further you go up the food chain, the less energy is being provided to you.